Ecclesiastes. That's where we will be spending most of our time this morning. And before we start, I'll go ahead and have a prayer. Dear Lord, God, we thank you for this time that you have given to us that we can come together and be strengthened and encouraged and grow in the knowledge of your word, Lord. You are great and perfect, and you have foreseen that these are things we would need to learn, things that we would require on this earth to be better servants of you. And God, we praise your name for that. We pray that we take these things into our heart, that we have a good discussion here today, and that we truly seek to spread your love and the knowledge of your word. And in your Son, Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so primarily, we're going to be going over Ecclesiastes 3, really the first 15 verses of Ecclesiastes 3. And if you were able to do the questions I sent out, you'll have noted that what we're coming to at this point in the book of Ecclesiastes is a bit of you might call it a preliminary thesis or a first argument or something like that, a first point. Solomon has set about in this grand, we've called it an experiment, we've called it like a theory at times. But what is the primary question, the primary issue Solomon has set out to answer or find for himself thus far? Starting all the way back in chapter 1. Right at the beginning of chapter 1, from the first several verses. Tristan.
Basically, what's the purpose of a man?
What's the point? Right? Why am I here?
I go, I live, I eat, I breathe, I sleep, I do all this stuff. Why? What's the point of my existence here? What's the point of doing any of it? And this first section, right, is kind of chapters 1 and 2. What has been the primary focus, right? What's been the primary concern with the issues Solomon struggled with, and what did he do, right, to help start to answer this question? What did he do in these chapters, and kind of what were the first issues he encountered?
He experienced a lot of things, and none of them filled the void he was trying to fill.
Yep. So the beginning of chapter 2, kind of 1 through 8, he talks about, right, he's engaging in this experiment, and this is how he started out in it. I built things, I owned people, I had riches and knowledge and wisdom, and he set it up in chapter 1, verse 8, all things are full of weariness, a man cannot utter it, the eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. So he engaged in all these things. He did these incredible works, wielded really the full might and power of his kingship. And as we kind of talked about, or I mentioned at the beginning of chapter 1 and when we started to study chapter 2, right, Solomon is going to present his action, right, or his observation on something. So in this case, he started out with, after his question, by doing all these great works, and then he's going to observe the outcome, and then he's going to come to a conclusion. And what was the outcome he observed after doing all these great works?
Vanity.
Right? And he was concerned. He said, I did all these great works, I built all these great things, and it just makes me upset. I turned about and I gave up my heart to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. This is chapter 2, verses 20 through 21. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. So he starts out to answer this question, and he begins, how do I find purpose in life? And he's very concerned with this idea of legacy, with this idea of work and the purpose behind it. And he says, I set about and did all of this, and I'm empty. I'm not satisfied. I'm actually upset because all I can think about is how the next person to come along is probably going to ruin all this. And at the end of chapter 2, kind of where we ended our class, Solomon is drawing his initial conclusion, and I like to frame this almost as, I use that word experiment, or you might even use the word like debate or question. just because that's a familiar terminology to me. And I like to view from chapters 1 really up to chapter 3, verse 15. That whole section is kind of the first leg or pillar of Solomon's argument, because he's beginning to come to his first conclusion and the first bit of hope we see in the book. And at the end of chapter 2, what was that first kind of pillar of hope that Solomon put forward to us?
He said life is purposeless.
Right? Everything's vanity, but, Ethan?
To the one who pleases God, there is joy in the toil that he's given.
Right.
So he said, everything I did is vanity. But when you're working for God, when you're using your knowledge and your riches and everything you've been given and you're using it for Him, there's joy in that. And apart from God, who can eat or have enjoyment? And that's kind of where we ended last class. And what we're about to see is he began the book with prose, and he's going to end his first point, or maybe you might call it, like put a checkpoint here, where he's going to start to transition to some other thoughts with another piece of prose, starting in chapter 3. Would somebody mind reading verses 1 through 9 of chapter 3? Tristan.
To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors?
Okay, thank you. And I want us to really understand that the question he ends this with is the same question from chapter 1, verse 3. What gain has the worker from his toil? In the ESV, chapter 1, verse 3 is, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? He is hearkening back to the way he started this book, right? So he's pulling on that same thought. We want to keep that idea and that theme in mind. This is all along the same strand.
But there's a difference here. And there's a difference that we should really take note of. And the first question I sent out, right, keeping in mind the themes and the ideas that we previously discussed, right, everything Solomon's brought out during this whole discussion, what do you think, what concept or philosophy is Solomon now trying to impart with verses 1 through 9? And I asked the question, how do the statements in these verses make you feel? And the reason I ask that is because I want us to really compare and contrast this with the way he started the book, right? Chapter 1 and that prose piece there and how that made us feel. Because we read that and the consensus is that's pretty depressing, right? It makes me kind of sad to be doing stuff and living and going about life. It doesn't make me feel very good to read that. So if we contrast what he says here with that, what is now different, right? What's being imparted to us in this piece right here?
He's acknowledging there is a time and a place for all the things that go on under the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And so while that's the case, though, ultimately still, if that's all that's in your scope, then you're going to have problems. But nevertheless, God has appointed a time for all these things to happen.
Right. Yeah, so he's
again kind of bringing forward that idea of there's a time for everything. Everything is going to happen, and there's still that cyclical idea of it. But what differs from the initial statements Solomon makes? What is, I think, changed from how he introduced these ideas to us?
There's a mixture of some of the sadness, but also still hope.
yes.
So there's, the first bit of prose was all depressing and sad, and vanity and pointlessness and unchanging. And this one kind of reframes it to be like, oh, that's true, but also like, there'll be times where you hop back and forth too. There'll be some good times and there'll be some bad times.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and to contrast, right, because he started out and we're seeing these words, weariness and dissatisfaction, and it just keeps happening, and it's vanity, and nothing, there's no remembrance of former things. And now there's that same idea, right, of everything's going to happen. There's a cycle we can't control that we're just part of, but there's hope here. And there's time for bad things to happen, but there's also time where good things are going to happen and things we can find enjoyment in. I think I saw Curtin and Louise.
Well, you hit it. I was thinking as I was reading this, he started with, you've got all these things, life is vanity.
Right.
But then in chapter 3, it's like, but it's not pointless.
Mhm.
Just because you can't impact these things doesn't mean there's no value in them, doesn't mean you can't learn, and it certainly does not mean that God's not in control
Right.
of these things.
That's exactly what I'm gonna say. We as humans gonna say, these things are good, these things are bad. Anger is bad, death is bad,
Mhm.
hard times are bad. But there's a reason and a season for all those things.
Yeah.
And there's things we learn and grow.
Yeah.
Tribulations.
Yes, of course.
And I think what we're going to see, right, because keep in mind that this is being prefaced with the statement, there is nothing better for a person that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil, right? And there is no delineation here between what toil or what season of life you're supposed to be finding enjoyment in. Chris?
The last verses of chapter 2, which are not divided by the author.
Right.
It seems like if we think about, okay, there are two ways that a man can be. He can be one who's good in God's sight, and he can be a sinner. And these things are going to happen either way. So it's our job to choose each day in each event which one we're going to be, what side are we going to be on.
Right.
And the reward will be following that decision.
Yeah. No, that's a fantastic.
Point in that, especially as we get towards the latter part of these verses that we're going to read, like especially 13 through 15. That's really a big point we're going to see hammered home here, is that bad stuff's going to happen, good stuff's going to happen, life is going to happen, right? But your job, our job on this earth, is to find contentment in it and to be on the right side. That's what matters, Phil.
11 ties it together, I believe, because that's, you have the contentment because you have a bigger picture with God in the picture.
Yes.
11 pretty much says that God's made everything beautiful in its time, and he's also put eternity in their hearts.
Yes.
So again, that helps the vision, the perspective, so that you can enjoy these things. Otherwise, you're like that guy at verse 26 of chapter 2, who, without God in the picture, there's no contentment. He's constantly laboring what it seems like for nothing, and he ends up being the servant of those who are righteous, maybe not directly, but in the sense that he never has any satisfaction in what he does.
Yeah.
And perhaps also the conclusion of verse 26 is whatever happens, even though it may seem bad to us, God will use it for his purpose.
Yeah.
Even if we're sinning.
Right. There is a greater purpose.
Being fulfilled here, and that's, we kind of started, and there's this idea of you can't really change anything, right? You do all these works, and there's nothing new under the sun. And initially, there was this frustration that really came through the text. Like, I'm working, I'm doing all this stuff. It doesn't matter. It's not new. I'm not changing anything. I can't change the winds. I can't change the sun. I can't change the ocean. It's all just going to keep happening. And what we're going to see now is that frustration really turned to hope when Solomon begins to accept the idea that I can't change what God's going to do. God's eternal, right? He's going to bring that up pretty shortly here. But what I can change is, am I going to be part of that eternity, or am I going to be fighting against it? Am I going to be one who is given wisdom and knowledge and joy, verse 26, or am I going to be one who is in the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God, striving after the wind? So we're going to really, I think, hammer home a lot of these ideas here and start to really draw on the initial, like, okay, this is how we find meaning in life. We're going to get those first kind of cornerstones for his argument here. So, the main difference, right, between where we started and where we're at right now in these pieces of prose is that now God is involved. When we started this, God wasn't involved. It was me, it was what I can do, my knowledge, my riches, my power. But now I'm accepting God. I'm looking at his works and I'm realizing how much greater they are than me. And I'm going to align myself to his plan, his cycle, not mine. Tristan?
Good job pointing out basically what I wanted to say. I think that there's the same uncontrollableness to it that was in chapter 1 that's still in chapter 3, but this time he's talking about specific places where there's a time for something to be done. I think a lot of times people want to stay in the fun times or
Yes.
the easier times, you know, but he's saying there's a purposeful time for each thing to happen. And so
Yes.
if you're trying to push a certain time frame past where it's supposed to be, I think it's against the profit that the worker's supposed to gain from each time and each season.
Oh, 100%. That's a fantastic point to make. Because
Sometimes you can read, like we like to, I always say I have this problem. I read a verse and my mind immediately wants to isolate it, right, from what's going on. So I read something like verse 26, and you get this idea of like, oh, God's just going to give me a bunch of joy because I'm serving him, and that's awesome. But Solomon says that, and immediately he goes into this talk about, well, you're going to have knowledge and joy and purpose and wisdom. It's not going to change the fact that there's a lot of bad stuff that's still going to happen. Life is going to go on. And like Tristan brought up, I mean, it's not about changing these things. That's a big point that Solomon's wrestling with right now is we can't change life. What we can change is how we use the events in life and how we use the things around us. We're going to use them to serve God. We're going to use them to try and serve self and end up with vanity. Right? It's a great point, Tristan. Anything else before we kind of move on to the next several verses? Okay. Alrighty. So let's go ahead and read verses 10 through 13. Would somebody mind doing that for me?
I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God.
that's great. What version is that? I really like
The way that read. I love that first part of verse 10. This is the God-given task of man. I like the way it puts that out. And very plainly, we do have a job here, right? There is a toil that has been appointed to man on this earth, right? The answer to all of his futility is not, well, I guess I'm just not going to work. No, you're still going to work. You're still going to do stuff. You're still going to be engaged in these things. The difference is you're going to recognize that God's given you a task. And one of the first things he says in verse 11, which we already brought up a little bit, God's made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. And so this is the second question I asked you all. What does that statement, right? God has put eternity into man's heart. What does that mean? And I asked you to compare these verses to chapter 2, verses 24 through 26, right? Where we have that statement that Tristan asked about at the end of last class, right? What does that mean that God is taking from the sinner and then giving to the one who pleases him? What is that about? What does that entail? I think we're finding some answers here. But let's start with the first part of that question. What does it mean that God's put eternity into man's heart?
There's been articles in the last few days about the Grand Canyon.
Mhm.
And so here's a good example. Somebody who's not a believer in God sees the Grand Canyon and they think it's a wonderful thing, but then they start trying to figure out, wait a minute, how could this have ever occurred? And so they're perplexed and trying to figure out all the earthly and physical ways that this could have happened. And it stumps them and they come up empty. A believer sees the same thing and they praise God and understand the glory of God, but for a glimpse.
Mhm.
I believe it's connected to that right there.
I think so as well.
I think that is definitely a huge part of it. Ethan?
Yeah, I don't know if this is the right read, but when I see that statement in isolation, that he has put eternity into man's heart, I guess I just can't help but think that mankind, it's almost like we know, and whether or not we know or believe it, but we at least all yearn for that there's got to be something beyond what we're experiencing right now. You know, I feel like when we look at all other kinds of philosophy and teaching and things that we teach, like at the root of it, like everybody is trying to answer this question about what is the point, and trying to answer the question, what is the point, is to seek what comes after. So like, you know, which is like kind of like the concept of eternity, right? Like what, like, is this it? What comes after? It's almost just like a struggle that we all deal with, like, and we're all trying to seek what it is. What is eternity? Is eternity a thing? And, you know, which is something that Solomon is trying to grapple with here. You know, kind of like what we've been talking about, kind of to Phil's point, right? Those who have God in the picture, like they know what eternity is. Like they seek it. They don't know, you know, exactly all that entails, right? Because like it says that they don't know everything, right? Like there's things that God has done from beginning to end that they won't know,
Mhm.
but they know, right? There is eternity, and people who don't have that, you know, what they seek is earthly eternity, which is like legacy, things that we can affect after we die or after we're gone, which is impossible,
Mhm.
right? So I don't know, that's a lot of rambling thoughts there, but like that struggle for what comes after, to me, is what I see when it says he put eternity into man's heart, that we want there to be, or we know there to be something more than this.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's actually,
That's like the exact same thought that I had initially on reading this, is because it's all part of the statement and the ideas Solomon starts out with, right? And he's so concerned with legacy. He's so concerned with there's never enough, right? I'm done all this. I'm still dissatisfied. There is call it what you will, a hunger, an innate curiosity, right? There is a drive within mortal man to find purpose on this earth. Why am I here? What can I do? How do I preserve my legacy or do great things, right? And there's this constant seeking after more and more and more. And we see that repeated millions of times throughout history by all these differing individuals, right? There's nothing new under the sun. And just like Phil said, the real eternity, and what I really believe verse 26 is talking about, is the fact that you have these two groups of people, right? You have, in verse 26, the sinner who goes about the business of gathering and collecting, and you have the one who is following God, who's seeking after God. And they're both seeing the same thing. I love your example of the Grand Canyon, right? They're both seeing the works on earth, they're both seeing the toil of man, and one of them is saying, well, we just got to keep toiling and keep working, and we got to keep finding out new things, and I'm sure we'll find a purpose in that. And the other one says, that's a beautiful thing God has done. That's incredible. That's permanent. I'm going to praise him for it. I'm going to do what he wants me to. And I can't know everything he's done from beginning to end. But I'm content with that. Because I know that God is eternal. And I know that if I align myself with him, I can experience that eternity. I think that's what my thoughts were on it. If there are differing thoughts, for sure, I'd love to hear what anybody else thinks. Any other, Chris?
Not to take away from what you just said, because that was awesome, but the dissatisfaction that what we think Solomon wrote this, that Solomon had for his works, or whoever this was had for their works, was probably because he he had eternity in his heart about, this is all temporary. It's whatever I can do is temporary.
No, I would agree with that 100% because
This book becomes so, I guess, powerful to me and very poignant in parts when we think about it. Like you said, I mean, we're reasonably sure that Solomon wrote this book, right? To consider the life of Solomon, right? The wisdom and the knowledge and the personal interaction that Solomon had with God. And then to come to this point in Ecclesiastes and see such just frustration and anger. And, I think we brought this up in the first class, is what one of the big struggles that we see Solomon grasping with, that he's coming to terms with here, is it's not enough to know God, right? It's not enough to understand the eternity inside you, right? It's not enough to realize these things. There's more that has to be done. There's a toil that has to be undertaken to find the contentment, to find the fulfillment for that eternity in our hearts, right? Now, that's a fantastic point.
Unbeliever becomes a slave to his surroundings because it always is it's the same old circle over and over again. And the believer becomes the freed man in this scenario in verse 26.
No, that's good. Yeah.
I think it's a struggle between, it's just, we've been talking about all the physical aspects of life. And that's great. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, but we just think there's got to be more than this.
Right.
There's got to be another dimension than just the physical.
Yeah. No, that's such a
big part of it, right? Because if you don't have the answer to that purpose, right, the answer to that drive, the question of what is the point of all these difficult things, right? Why do I build these great works and somebody comes and tears them down? Why do I work my whole life for something and then it doesn't really matter? You just work the job and nobody cares, right? There's that, like you're saying, if that focus is purely on the physical, there's no end to that vicious cycle.
So with that in chapter 8, in 15, 16, 17. So I commended enjoyment because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry.
Yep.
For this will remain with him in his labor for the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business which is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day or night, then I saw all the works of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. And that's where he ended up.
Yeah. No, for sure.
I like that you brought that up, because I think it's very helpful, like we mentioned before, to remember the conclusion of these things, that it's to serve God and keep His commandments. And that's the whole toil of man that Solomon's going to take a real roundabout path to find it, but that's where he's gonna get there and realize that. That's what this is all building to. It's a great point. All right, so then just going over verses 12 and 13, right? There's nothing better to be joyful, do good as long as they live, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. So when we go back to the seasons, right, from 1 through 9, that is talked about a time for this, a time for that, a time for this, a time for that. What I wanted to highlight here is that God's gift to man is that regardless of the season you're in, right, and this is partially a gift and it's partially a challenge. It's partially, I think, part of the toil that man is given, is that you should be eating and drinking and taking pleasure in that toil, regardless of the season you're in. Because there's no dividing line here made by God, made by Solomon, and that, when the toil's difficult, it's okay to say, I hate life, and, I'm going to go kick rocks, and it's going to be a tough time, I'm going to complain about all this. In the bad seasons, your gift and your toil, your work for God, to find contentment in that, to find joy and purpose in the seasons of death, the seasons of work, the seasons of breaking down, the seasons of weeping and mourning and casting away, to refrain from embracing, to lose, to tear, to keep silent. And at the conclusion of this first point, right, that's going to be, I think, the challenge that we start to see emerge from here, is that there is contentment and there is joy and hope in life when we're focused on God. There's still a really hard work to be done. Because when you have that eternity in your heart and you recognize that purpose of God, it means that when times get tough, when they get difficult, when the rest of the world is complaining and commiserating about how hard life is and trying to find workarounds for it, you're saying, no, this is the time to glorify God. This is the time to be content with the blessing the Lord has given. Tristan.
I notice is, we kind of almost imply that one of these things is good, one of these things is bad, because they're almost
Right.
at different ends of the spectrum there. But he doesn't start the passage saying, here's the good and bad
Yeah.
things. In fact, he says, verse 11, everything's beautiful in this time. So I think the challenge there is, how is it beautiful?
Yeah.
Find the beauty in it.
That's a really good point to make. Yeah, that naturally, when we see these contrasting ideas, we want to make them really black and white, right? We want to separate them with good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. But you're absolutely right. The challenge is finding the beauty in all of it and finding the purpose in all of it. Kurt and then Chris.
Tristan's point reminds me of that passage that says it's better to go to the house of mourning.
Mhm.
One of the reasons it is better to go to the house of mourning, a very sad and difficult place, is because that's where you find God.
Yeah.
You know, as a human, we're not out looking for God when things are great, or when we're at a party, or when we're with our friends playing games. And that's not what we do.
Mhm.
When you're in the house of mourning, that's when your heart reaches out. You're in pain, you're achy, you're horribly sad. That's when you see God.
Yeah.
And to the point, in a lot of these bad days, that's where you find God.
That's a good one.
Of those first 8 verses, a time to hate is one of the most challenging for me. Because it's like, well, we're not supposed to hate, we're supposed to love, you know? But what Dennis reminded us of is that there is a time to hate.
Yeah.
And when we are hating what God hates, then we're growing closer to Him.
Right. No, that's a really great point. I think you read through verses 1 through 9.
I'm sure each and every one of us can point to one of these portions and say, that feels like the time I'm in right now, you know, or I remember when I went through that time, right? And there's struggle there, and there is an innate part of just, we're not going to be having the best of times all the time, right? But the idea, like Tristan said, is all of these times, right, they help you grow closer to God. That's why he brought up as well in chapter 2, I think, that, you know, the wise person sees where he's going, right? Part of the wisdom of God is that throughout all of these difficult times, you see where you're going, right? You see that, you know what, there's a greater purpose behind all this, beyond just the pain I'm feeling or whatever I'm trying to work through right now. It's a great point. Okay, let's go ahead and, what time do we have? A good bit of time. We'll read the last 2 verses, verses 14 through 15. Would somebody mind reading that for me real quick? Ethan.
I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it, so that the people fear before him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is, I like to call this the acceptance, right? This is the conclusion to Solomon's first foundational question, right? And he struggled so much with this concept of what I leave behind, what I'm working for, what is coming after, what's coming before me. And he gets to this point, and the only legacy that matters is God's. The only thing that is built that has any relevance upon this grand scale of time is God's. And the last question I wanted us to answer, if we consider 14 through 15, that's 16 up there, but verses 14 through 15 as the conclusion, right, kind of to that first idea introduced, or maybe not conclusion necessarily, but like the stopping point. He's going to build from here. He's kind of wrestled with this idea of legacy. He's going to have answered part of it, and he's going to continue moving on. What would you say right now is the answer to the question asked in chapter 1, verse 3? How would you answer that question he puts forward? And the second part of that is, he started with despair, but what is now giving us and him hope as we ask this first question? How does that question go from something of despair to something of hope now? How would you answer it? Maybe a bit too low.
I'll try. It's kind of already been pointed out that whatever we do is God makes for good.
Mhm.
So, yeah, we don't necessarily see the benefit here, but God has purpose for it.
I think that's a great answer, Tristan.
I just put simply, the prophet is God's.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the answer.
Largely lies in, I don't know if detachment is the right word, but the answer to this question largely lies in the fact that we're not here to gain something. Right? I'm not put on this earth to be richer. I'm not put on this earth to make big buildings and plant forests and have lots of people working for me. I'm here to serve God. And there's no, if I was seeking out, if my question is how can I profit from my toil? Well, the answer is you can't. You're not going to profit from your toil. But if your purpose is to fear God and keep His commandments, chapter 12, where we're going to end up, where Solomon's going to end up, then what you don't do is you don't waste away your life worrying about kingdoms or being richer or being successful. Instead, you align yourself with the only eternal thing that is ever going to happen in this universe. The only way you can truly have, if you want to call it legacy or impact, is by allowing God to work through you, by aligning yourself with His grand plan.
You just said there, because it's not just, being a servant of God is more than just serving. And God has promised us a special place and by being His adopted children and teaching us His ways. When we embrace the ways of God, that's where satisfaction is, that's where good is, that's where peace is.
Right.
And so the scoffer would say, oh, you're just being a servant to this God that just wants you as a toy. That's not what God has offered at all. He's offered a place in His household. He's offered the gift of His ways and his instructions, because that's the only thing where good resides.
Yeah.
The place where good resides.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just thinking, going back to the idea of, I love how you pointed out of that God is the only eternal thing that has been or ever will be. And I think it puts a lot of things into perspective, right? Because I feel like a lot of the things, a lot of the frustrations you see with people who don't believe, or like Phil talked about, don't understand where satisfaction comes in service, and how could there possibly be any beauty in all these quote bad times that we would see it as bad? Why would God, we can be frustrated like Solomon is in the first chapter. Well, why did God set it up this way where we can't do anything and we can't change anything and our life kind of is terrible and all this stuff? And I feel like you hear a lot of that nowadays, when people are arguing against or claiming this is why the Bible's false, or why God is actually bad because He's purposely set up all these, quote bad things whatever. But I just think when you look at this verse about God has put eternity in a man's hearts, and we know that God is eternal, a lot of those frustrations I think come from our habit to think that our life here is the most important life that we'll
Right.
live, right? And which is natural because this is the only life we know
Yeah.
right now. This is what we were born to. This is all we see, and so because of that, it's frustrating and it's unfair, and there's all these bad things. And why would God set it up this way? And how could we possibly find any satisfaction in serving the God who set it this way? But when we think of it in eternal terms, and we realize that not only is this life temporary, but also it's not the most important part,
Mhm.
right? It's fleeting, and there is a more important, part of life to come. That's where the perspective comes in, and think of it in that eternal perspective. We can look at, even with the frustrations, because we don't fully understand why God has set up this way. Like it also said in that verse, we know that this life isn't important.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes it easy to be like, it's cool. I'll suffer stuff in this life because this life actually doesn't even ultimately really matter as
Mhm.
much as what's coming.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of a little bit going back to what it means to put eternity into our hearts, like the perspective to realize that what we're going through right now is not the most important thing. Even
Right.
though right now it feels like it is.
Right.
It's not.
Yeah. There's that.
I guess that idea of like primacy that comes with being a conscious individual, right? Like this is, I know what's in my mind, my life, and it's so easy unconsciously to kind of picture yourself as being the center of the universe, right? Like I don't know what that person's thinking. I don't know what's going on over there, but I know what I want to do, and I know what my life's about. And what I really love that Solomon brings up here at like this point where he's setting up this first idea of eternity, right? And God's plan is the way verse 15 puts it. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. And I can't help but think back to right at the beginning of chapter 1 in verses 10 and 11. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new, it has been already in the ages before us, there is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. And kind of like Ethan was pointing out, there is this innate frustration that comes from the selfish physical idea of what I can accomplish, right? And when your actions and what you want to do and your physical goals are the center of your universe, there is such a pain and a frustration coming to the realization that in the scheme of time, you are an insignificant percentage of a percentage, right? And from a physical standpoint, you can't really change anything. You can't have a lasting effect, and you can't do anything that truly is going to matter. And to end it this way, or to conclude this first point this way in verse 15, right? You know who does remember what has been? God. You know who's always going to be? God. Guess who's going to look after the forgotten things? God. So all of these concerns that we have as mortal individuals, right? What I do doesn't matter. Who I am doesn't matter, right? Nothing I do comes to any purpose. I'm just constantly going through these hard times. I can't ever seem to get ahead in life. It's because your job isn't to get ahead. Your job isn't to make things good. It's to join yourself to the eternal purpose, to the God beyond time, beyond this plane of existence, and to be part of something everlasting. And that is your content. That is your purpose on this earth. And there is no greater thing you can do than to serve God and keep His kingdom. So, what I just kind of want us to capstone here is don't think of this necessarily as an ending point, but this is going to be the first pillar or foundation upon which Solomon is going to then compound the rest of the book, because he's not done here. The next word in verse 16 is moreover. So there's something else I got to think about. There's something else I got to say. But we're starting with the realization and the acceptance that we know how to be part of something great. We know what our purpose is, and it's to serve God. It's to work for the eternal purpose. Right? Any other questions or comments about that before we kind of finish up here? All right. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, for your questions and contributions. The next class is just going to be picking up from there and going into chapter 4. I will try to have the questions sent out before next Saturday. So thank you all for your time.